So this recorded lecture is going to be focused around running records and how to write them and document children's behavior in the form of a running record. So before I introduce the running record detailed descriptions of what makes something a running record, I want to just reiterate and go back over some guidelines for observing. So when you are out observing your child and doing some of these observations, you want to remember to be close enough to hear them. So be in their hearing, your hearing field of the child. And then as much as you possibly can, try not to interfere with their play and or whatever interactions they're having. And of course, if they do come up to you or they do engage and initiate an interaction with you, try at first to just say, redirect them and get them back over to what they were doing or their play, and just let them know that you're working on your teacher work or something like that. But, if that doesn't work, of course, you're going to not be rude and interact with them. But as soon as you possibly can, you want to redirect them and get them back to where they're playing and interacting with other children or other adults, and you're really just meant to be that observer, or sort of think of yourself as that fly on the wall. Of course, anything that you document and write down, you always want to keep confidential, so make sure it's in a folder or a binder, those types of things, and don't leave it out, in a notebook or something, and try not to leave it out and exposed for others to read. And then it's also really important to remember that we want to observe at different times a day, but also different locations, those different settings, so that you have so that you're able to capture a really good picture of the child and their skills and behavior for mastery. Because one of the pieces of mastering a skill or behavior is that a child has to do it consistently over time and in different settings. And so it's really important that you try to gear your observations around that, so that when you are reviewing and reflecting your data, your notes that you've taken, that you really have a good broad spectrum and a clear indication of whether or not they've mastered something. All right, so with our running record, running records do differ from our anecdotal notes in a few general ways, and that's what I'm going to talk about. So a running record is a detailed narrative of a child's behavior that includes a sequence of events. So that's the key piece right there. It's a sequence of events. And it includes an opportunity for you to include notes or interpretations of those events and the behaviors or skills that you saw take place during those different events. So opposed to an anecdotal note, which is a snapshot and it's really looked at as one event. It's just a moment you're documenting very quick. I, again, always like to reiterate that when you do anecdotal notes, really think of an anecdotal note as being something that can fit on a Post-it note. That is a quick snapshot of a single moment or event, and that's an anecdotal note. And this is what we use most frequently in our gathering of observational documentation. Running records, though, we have to plan for a little bit more, because we have to be able to observe long enough to see a sequence of events. And so it oftentimes means that we have to set aside time or make arrangements in our day with our co-teachers to be able to set aside that opportunity of time where we can observe for a longer chunk of time in order to see those sequence of events. So that is a little bit there in terms of the definition related to an anecdotal, or I'm sorry, a running record. So again, it's a detailed narrative of a child's behavior that includes a sequence of events and notes or interpretations, and sometimes time or event tracking. And I have another slide that will talk about that. So with a running record, it's our best attempt to record everything that happens during that designated time period. So whatever time period you've kind of set aside for yourself, that's what we're trying to do. Now, typically on average, a basic running record is going to be a standard 10 minutes. But it actually can go longer than that. And there have been times where I observed for a full 30 minutes. So, it depends. It depends on why you're needing to observe that long and what the issue is or what you're trying to look at, in terms of the event sequence and what might be happening. So, but on average, we spend at least 10 minutes, observing and documenting everything that we possibly can in that 10 minutes, all of the events that take place. So, so that is that piece there. And then running records, can include, again, a time period, over a few minutes, right? That's that short sort of, 10-minute type thing, or even, over a few weeks or a month. And so what happens is that we gather a few of these, and then we can really look at and see a much bigger picture in terms of behavior and what might be going on. The other thing is that typically running records are used more for tracking and looking at behavior more so than skills and behaviors. An anecdotal note, we're observing for more for those everyday type things. Running record, because again, the way the parameters around it, we just don't have time in a day to be able to do this. And really it's meant to kind of watch one, maybe two children specifically for a longer period of time in order to see some patternings related to time or again, event location, that type of thing, so that we can get to the bottom typically of behaviors. And so this is where we don't go into great detail about this in some of these courses, but it goes into more detail in the guidance class. But when we have a child who has developed some type of behavior, biting, hitting, kicking, that kind of thing, aggression, whatever, and it's becoming a problem, typically where we start is by stepping back and doing running records so that we can get a good long picture, that sequence of events, and we can time track, event track, those types of things, so that we can look for patterns related to the behaviors, so that we can get to so we can figure out what we call the ABCs of a behavior, and that's looking at the antecedent, which is sort of the trigger, and then B is the behavior itself, the hitting, the kicking, the biting, and then C stands for the consequence. What is actually making it so that behavior is reoccurring. And so that is typically why we would use the anecdotal or the running record. And that's the only time I've ever had to use it in my classrooms was when there was a behavioral issue and I was trying to get to the antecedent, figure out what was the trigger and what was going on, so that we could address it and make whatever necessary changes for that child. All right. So a little bit more about running records. So again, the task is to record as much as we possibly can, but record it in a way that a future teacher or somebody else reading this can be able to visualize it. And again, the best way that we do that is through descriptive note-taking, being very descriptive and factual, and that is also called objective. So we want to write our running records. They're written objectively, just like your anecdotal notes, but you do get to now include a little bit of your interpretations or notes, but those are done off to the side, and you'll see that in the running record form that I'm going to provide to you. So It does require that you are fully focused and you can, again, set aside that long period of time and be free of any interruptions as much as possible. And then unlike the anecdotal, unlike the anecdotals, running records are written in present tense. So that is going to be things like Johnny is jumping up and down, rather than when we write our anecdotal, it was past tense, and that was Johnny was jumping up and down, or whatever, or Johnny jumped, past tense. This is present tense, live, happening in the moment. It's happening right now, and so we're writing it in our present tense. So that is another part to the running record that is different from anecdotal. And then I briefly talked about this already, and I'll briefly talk about it here. But again, with running records, this is when we oftentimes will add in, and really it's to the discretion of the observer. If do you need to add in time tracking, because are you trying to look for, is this happening every day at a certain time or a certain time period, or event sampling. Maybe it, rather than it happening at a certain time, it's happening in a certain location, or a particular setting in your classroom. So that is what the time sampling and the event sampling is about. So again, the purpose of the time sampling is really to look at frequency of behavior. How often is it occurring, and then when? And so that we can look for patterns around that. And then the event sampling, same thing here. Instead of sampling time, we are looking at, does the behavior tend to occur in a particular location or setting, rather than that predictable time. And again, looking for patterns. So we want to be able to do a few of these so that we have a good pattern, or can look at that. And I want to refer you guys back to this slide. When we covered anecdotal note-taking, I showed you this slide, but it gives some of the information related to being descriptive and interpretive. So with those anecdotal notes, again, and the running record, you want to write descriptively, which is being objective, and that's facts, factual. So what are the specific facts or details that you're seeing? So you still are going to write your anecdote or your running record in this way. But we have a designated spot set off to the side where we get to be subjective and put in what our initial reactions, thoughts, feelings are, what we think is the cause or the reason that the child might be doing this or doing that, or whatever it might be. Oh, she's crying. I think she's sad because her mom just left. Those types of things. We can write those in on the side, but we're still going to write, Sally has tears running down her face and she is crying. So you're still going to write that objectively and descriptively with detail, but then off to the side, you can add in what you think or feel about why she's crying. Oh, I think she's crying because her mom just left. She seems sad, or things like that. We get to put that off to the side in that subjective interpretive area of the notes. So they're separate from the actual running record. So there's some advantages. It can be adapted to different uses, as I've mentioned, and why and how, and that's where, the event stamping and all of that comes into play. It does provide us a lot more information about the child and their behaviors than an anecdotal does. Again, because it's that sequence of events and it's a longer period of time frame, and you're gathering more information, like the time that it's happening and the location, in terms of, the frequency and that type of thing. Again, we can observe children doing these behaviors in their natural settings. So that's also an advantage to it. And we can serve, again, being biased, but then also being able to validate some of the other reasons that we think things are happening, and be able to use some of that in our assessment measures as well. Some disadvantages is that running records take time and training to do. You need more teacher coverage. As I mentioned, you have to make more arrangements in order to do it. And you can't engage with the children and interact with them during this time frame. So those are some of the disadvantages. All right, guys, so that is it on running records, and look for your assignments connected to this soon.